Stewart, Senate Republican leader. Another weekly press conference, true to form. We're going to go through our policy area of the week and then also have time for Q&A at the end here. Understand we got a hard stop at 1 because folks got to get over to committees. Today's subject will be on election integrity, and so we have a number of different initiatives that Republicans are moving forward this session around that topic. And to kick it off, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Matt Pouliot, and he's going to go through an initiative. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Good afternoon, State Senator Matt Pouliot. I'm the lead for the Labor and Housing Committee and also the lead on the Housing Committee. According to the nonprofit Freedom House, which is dedicated to strengthening democracy around the world, all parties in a healthy democracy should compete to garner the broadest possible support from voters and adhere to electoral rules that maximize both voter participation and administrative impartiality. I'm here to talk about that impartiality, which is needed to ensure that our voters have confidence in Maine's electoral system. As you see in the handout, which we provided to you, the nation's perceptions of electoral integrity, or PEI index, as measured by Harvard University's Electoral Integrity Project, has taken a real hit in the past decade. There are many factors contributing to that. Some include campaign coverage by local press and TV news, lacking fairness and balance while social media amplified that misinformation, campaign finance lacking transparency and equitable access, and a worsening confidence in the integrity of American elections and falling trust. So the role of government administration shouldn't be one of them. By introducing LD 34, we're showing to show a photo ID when you vote, which is supported by 80% of Americans, according to Gallup, and more importantly, 63% of Mainers, according to a recent University of New Hampshire poll. My intent to accomplish here is 3 goals. 1, promote voter confidence in the integrity of Maine's voting system. 2, to provide more access to those who may feel disenfranchised. And 3, improve accountability and transparency in the process. Whether voter fraud or impersonation exists isn't the question here, actually. A few cases over the years prove that it does. Our job as lawmakers is to minimize the risk of it, which is really our job with any of our government processes. The bottom line is people need an ID to open a bank account, have a drink at a bar, buy a pack of cigarettes, to buy a cell phone service contract, to get on an airplane, to be hired at a job and work, to purchase a car, to donate blood, to buy a firearm, to buy a house, to check out a library book, and yes, even drive. So why should people not have an ID to vote? 35 states require voter ID. 2 more, Nebraska and Ohio, are currently implementing it. Maine's perception of electoral integrity index scores have constantly ranked in the top 10 in the country, but let's be number 1. And one thing I want to add is that we heard at the public hearing of this bill that this would be, suppressing people's right to vote. And that's the last thing that any of us want, which is why we're encouraging that every Maine resident be issued a free photo ID by the Secretary of State. This was supported by a majority of the committee just recently, and I hope that this will get passed through the legislative process. It's one step in the right direction to ensure integrity in the process.
Thanks, Matt. Another major component around this whole topic of election security, right, is what we have seen, a new phenomenon occurring across the entire country where billionaires, namely Mark Zuckerberg, has been providing funds to states to administer their elections. Now, conveniently, these funds typically flow to pockets and hubs of folks that share the same ideology as Mr. Zuckerberg, namely urban liberal areas, and to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars going to places like Portland and all the surrounding communities there, like Lewiston and like Bangor in the state of Maine. Millions of dollars has flowed through our state in the last election cycles to increase voter turnout there, which I don't have an issue with increasing voter turnout, but why does it need to be in the most urban areas that also have the strong trend line of voting for Democrats? The reality is this shouldn't be happening. And frankly, if any municipality is struggling with administrating their elections, Shame on us as legislators, as the appropriators, who can and need to be stepping up to the plate to make sure that our municipalities have the support financially that they need to run free, fair, and honest elections. It shouldn't be left up to the richest people in the country to literally drop in, decide how these elections are now going to be run, and then bankroll them in areas that they know would agree with whatever their political philosophy is. That's wrong, that's not right. It's something that's been, by and large, swept under the rug, but is something that we are taking action towards as a caucus to address this session, and you will see legislation to that effect being printed shortly. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Jeff Timberlake, who is our lead on the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee, which has jurisdiction over these issues.
Makes sense to it. Good afternoon. I am Senate Republican lead for the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee. And as you know, we are the committee of jurisdiction for all things election related. So far, both Senator Pouliot and Senator Stewart have described common sense solutions for protecting voter integrity. For the moment, registration for polling places and making sure the federal government and private companies like Facebook don't interfere in our elections. It's not hard to see how these issues can affect voter confidence. What I'm here to talk about is the ballot integrity, which is the foundation of our entire election system. Regardless of whether you believe election fraud is rampant in Maine or elsewhere, it does exist. It might be large or it might be very small. Such is the case with 2 students who were charged in Orono. But we can't live in a vacuum with our heads buried in the sand, hoping it will never happen. That is just unreasonable. In business, we have a concept called risk management. It's where we put policies and internal controls in place to manage potential problems of what may happen. From employee theft to OSHA policies, we always have a plan for the worst. State government is no different. We put safeguards in to protect our driver's license process. We put processes in place to ensure minors can't purchase alcohol at our local stores. We audit, or hopefully we audit, Maine Care and providers to make sure we're getting billed properly and reducing fraudulent claims. And we have protections in place to prevent unemployment fraud. So if we spend all these resources to protect our systems, what is so different about protecting our ballot process? Republicans have introduced a set of bills to ensure we don't allow ballot harvesting or impersonation, which is what happened in the forgery case of the students in Orono and farther in Oakland. We submitted a bill to limit unmonitored drop boxes, which prevents the potential of a midnight dump of unauthorized or false ballots. And we have 2 bills to make sure we have a standardized chain of custody process in place on how we treat absentee ballots. Whether fraud happens is not what this is about. Our responsibility is to put common sense protections in place and manage the risk of just once. As this bill says about voter integrity, I think the most important thing about voter integrity might be all the people who I've talked to as we knock on doors that say to me, I'm not voting. That's voter integrity, because they don't believe there's integrity in the system. And so they are just as important to make sure they vote, because they believe that their vote is being counted. So that is one of the reasons that I'll be fighting for all of these common sense laws, is to make sure that all those people who don't vote because they're concerned that their vote is not being counted, that we make sure their vote is also counted. So thank you very much.
All right, so you've heard a number of different initiatives from our caucus. Happy to take questions about those initiatives, and then we can save the remaining few minutes to have a general Q&A on anything else that's going on.
One bill that wasn't talked about, it says it's Senator Kimes' bill, an act to require identification on absentee ballots. How would that work? Is that with signatures on the envelopes and by 2 people before they're sent in? What's the mechanism you're proposing?
That bill has not yet been printed, and so I would have to get back to you with that information.
Do you have a concept or an idea?
It is a concept draft, which I didn't review before I came in here today,
Okay.
so I don't want to misstate it, but I would be happy to get that to you right afterwards.
Great. And Senator Brakey just left, but this says an act to prohibit the use of ballot drop boxes. Is it the Republicans' position that we should have no more ballot drop boxes in town halls for absentee ballots?
So I'm not 100% sure what Brady's bill does. You have to talk to him about the details. But as you heard Senator Timberlake mention, it leads to a lack of confidence in the system when there's the possibility of an unmonitored space where folks are depositing ballots, maybe on their own behalf, maybe on somebody else's behalf. But it's something that, and I understand, COVID created a lot of havoc, right, and threw a bunch of wrenches into the system. But we're beyond that, and we need to move beyond that. We need to get back to a system that's more secure and that's more commonsensical and will re-inspire folks' confidence in the system.
You may have answered this, or Senator Timberlake may have talked about it, but we've had several elections now, since COVID. We have one of the, I think it's brought up during the public hearing, we have one of the highest voter participation rates in the country. And we've had pretty large-scale use of absentee balloting for years and years, and we don't have any widespread issues of fraud. A few incidents, but I mean, I guess can someone speak to that? Like, why are some of these initiatives necessary if we have really high voting participation and high use of absentee ballots? We're not seeing any of these issues here in Maine, and people have looked.
So I'd say, first off, there are issues of fraud. We talked about that. I'm not going to relitigate that. We've talked about that multiple times today. But
Very isolated individual cases.
so there is fraud going on, so you acknowledge that, and I appreciate that. So the reality is, again, to go back to Zuckerbucks, right, the issue that I mentioned in my segment. Why are hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing to places like Portland and not to Presque Isle? Okay, the reason why, I mean, we can dance around it or we can call a spade a spade. The reason why is because Mark Zuckerberg's interest was in electing Democrats. And that's why he put money into Maine elections to try to manipulate that outcome. Now, if we want to increase voter engagement, sure, I'm all for that, but let's do it fairly and let's do it internally as a state rather than letting billionaires come in and buy elections with their private money. That is a notable gap in the system that exists. It absolutely does exist. There are plenty of numbers, and I'm happy to provide the spreadsheet of all the places that Zuckerbucks went to in the last election cycles. And let me tell you, by and large, it was not in rural Maine. And the corollary there is because rural Maine, by and large, doesn't vote for Democrats.
So that
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to answer part of this. I think if you listen to what I said about drop boxes, I think it's important that drop boxes are monitored. I think that everybody feels that there may not be any fraud there, or there may be some fraud there, but there shouldn't be any fraud. And I think the other thing you heard me say is, we got a bunch of people that are not voting from what we would call maybe our side of the Republican side of the aisle, because they think that there is a problem. So why aren't we just as concerned about making sure that everybody votes? Because I think it's important that everybody votes from both sides. And if we have people that I know that within my district is when I'm out knocking on doors are saying to me, I'm not going to bother to vote, it doesn't count, it doesn't make a difference anymore. I think that's just as important, that we protect them and make them feel that elections are secure and safe as we do to say there is no fraud and elections are secure and safe. Because there are some people that feel differently than what others feel. And we need to look at all of those people and address all of those issues, because they're all citizens of the state of Maine. It's very important that we represent all of them, not just those that think one way or the other. And so I'm not saying eliminate drop boxes. I just say that if you're gonna leave them outside of the building, you should have a camera up on the building that's monitoring. They're making sure somebody isn't coming in at 2 o'clock in the morning with a box of things and start stuffing a whole bunch in the drop box. I don't believe it's happening down in my heart, but how do you know if you don't? I don't think people steal in my hardware store, but the other day while I was managing, I managed to lose a 3/8 Milwaukee drill, and my daughter kind of hollered at me because that went $384 out the door, and I didn't catch it. So there are people that do steal too. So, these things happen. And it's all about keeping honest people honest. And I think this is what we're at.
How do you respond as a party to the argument that, Democrats are gonna make that you're trying to solve problems that don't exist, that you're in essence going to end up, while this isn't your intent, making voting harder for a number of people in Maine?
Well, I guess my question to you back to that would be, do Democrats admit that there's people not out there not voting because they don't believe that the system is secure? It's just as equal that side.
But who's responsible for that perception? Isn't President Trump most responsible for that perception and the stories he told about the 2020 election?
I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't believe that. I think it's our job as legislators in the state of Maine to make sure the people of the state of Maine feel that what we're doing is protecting everybody and making it as honest and sincere as we can.
Senator Pouliot, you're a voter.
Again,
Sorry,
I gotta come back to this, right? And again, there is an obvious problem, right? There are obvious problems in the system that we are allowing to transpire. Now, the Democrats took advantage of that in the last cycle. Now, if that gap remains open, Republicans would be able to do the same thing, and there's nothing to say that the Koch brothers couldn't come in next and bankroll Republican elections, right? And not just, again, this isn't like they cut a check to somebody's PAC and then ran independent expenditures to support a candidate. They literally engaged in the administration of elections in the state of Maine. Mark Zuckerberg engaged in the administration of state elections, okay? Why is that okay for anybody? Regardless of who you support, regardless of what your political ideology is. It's wrong, it needs to be stopped, it's an obvious gap. It has nothing to do with suppressing vote. If anything, fine, spread it out equally, right? Or better yet, and what we really ought to do is the state ought to pay its share of the administration of that election. A core staple of democracy is that elections are free and fair. They ought to be paid for by the state legislature. We ought to do our job rather than relying on the next billionaire to come in and move his agenda.
so if these things that you're talking about, like photo ID, have a cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, according to the Secretary
We should
of State.
pay it.
Sorry?
We should pay it. We should pay it. We should do our job as the appropriators and pay it. Shame on us if we don't.
Senator Pouliot, the bill you talked about, your bill, is probably the most, for lack of a better word, mainstream, if you will, most bipartisan. Like you said, 35 states already have it. That's states with Democratic and Republican governors. Do you have any Democratic co-sponsors, or do you hope to get some Democratic support for that bill? Because that's been proposed before here and it hasn't passed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, what we're really wanting to do is send the message that integrity in the process is important, and we as a state should be investing in that. So what's one way that we're going to do that? This is not a panacea. It's not like, oh, everybody has a voter ID, so fraud's gone. You know what I mean? That's like saying everybody has a driver's license, nobody's going to speed. I mean, come on. But at least when you get pulled over, the officer can say, hey, give me your ID. And if you don't have it, then there's a penalty involved, potentially. I mean, I was at Verizon last week getting a new iPhone, and a woman walked in, she's like, hey, I'm here to pick up my phone. And she gave her phone number, her name, everything. Like almost a blood sample. And they're like, we cannot give you your phone. Why? You don't have your ID. And she got all huffy and left. I mean, how come there's not a bill put in by the Democrats to like protect their rights to have access to their phone then? If we're only doing this, you know what I mean, in these cases where it's supposedly suppression by the fact that we're asking somebody for an ID, you know what I mean? This happens across the board with so many things that we're accustomed to. And in the event that there is actually, you know, like a dozen of these people out there that don't have an ID, or maybe more, maybe it's like 10 dozen or 100 dozen or whatever it is, like send people to their house with a Nissan Leaf, you know, at 48 miles a gallon and snap their photo and give them an ID. That's the level of customer service we have to take as government to ensure integrity in the process.
So right now, no Democratic co-sponsors, but you're looking for one.
Sounds to me from Senator Timberlake that majority of the committee members did vote to support in the budget report back to appropriations this idea of a free ID for everybody.
Okay.
You know, and if everybody has an ID for free from state, why can't you be asked to be an adult and bring it with you when you vote? I mean, we're not asking for a lot here.
We got time for one more question, then folks got a jet at 1, so, on this subject or any other?
I'll just mention that regarding the IDs, keep in mind that the state has been charging, was it $20 for real IDs for all this time, yet you can't use the real ID. And so that money should be returned to people who were sold a bill of goods. A couple of other notes that I'd like to make. I've been around long enough to remember voter fraud. Joanne Pendexter's election in the legislature was overturned because of voter fraud, votes that were found in a town hall. And I was here for Ballotsgate. So unfortunately, these things do happen. My understanding is also that one of those receptacle boxes was damaged in another state. A fire occurred, intentionally damaged, votes were lost. There's no integrity there. So I think we're asking for just voter integrity, and we want, I think we want people to believe in the system. As the good senator said, we want people to believe in the system. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.